came home to find nothing but a pile of rubble where my house used to be. No warning, no natural disaster, no fire trucks or police tape, just a flattened concrete pad, scattered pieces of what used to be my front porch, and a sign staked in the dirt that read, "Structure. Removed per HOA enforcement. Violations documented." I stood there for a full minute, suitcase in one hand, briefcase in the other, blinking at the scene like it would suddenly reverse itself. It didn't. My home, my legally purchased, permit-approved, city-inspected home, had been demolished. The only person who had anything to say about it was the HOA president, Karen. It started 3 weeks earlier. I'd filed a building permit to extend my front porch by 4 feet, just enough to add a sitting bench and an access ramp for my aging father. The permit was approved by the city. I used a licensed contractor. Everything was by the book. Then came the HOA letter, thinly veiled as a courtesy reminder. Karen said I hadn't submitted the addition for board review. I reminded her that city permits supersede HOA preference. She didn't like that. The week before I left for a legal seminar in D.C., Karen knocked on my door and tried to give me a compliance plan she'd written herself. Handwritten, no HOA vote, no meeting minutes, just her and her pen. I refused it. She told me, "You think you're above the rules, but everyone here plays by the same code." I looked her in the eye and said, "I write the rules." What she didn't know, what she never bothered to ask, was that I'm a sitting state judge, civil court, 10 years on the bench. I've issued more restraining orders than she's filed petty complaints. And I presided over HOA disputes uglier than a collapsing retaining wall. But I didn't throw that in her face. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. Clearly, that was a mistake, because now I was standing ankle-deep in sawdust, staring at the remains of a home she had no right to touch. I called the police, filed a report. The responding officer's eyes widened when I showed him my judicial badge. He looked back at the leveled property and muttered, "This is going to be messy." He wasn't wrong. I called the contractor listed on the sign. No license number, just a first name and a disconnected number. Karen had hired an unlicensed crew. No permits, no warning, no official violation proceedings. Just a demolition, executed while I was out of town, on her self-declared authority. I took photos of everything. The concrete scars where the porch had been torn up, the exposed utility lines, the busted irrigation piping, the note printed in block letters and laminated, claiming hoax hoke, enforcement as justification. And then I walked across the street, up to Karen's door, and rang the bell. She opened it slowly, already on the defensive. Her mouth twitched when she saw me. "Oh," she said, voice thin. "I didn't know you were back." "I noticed something missing," I replied. "Roughly 2,000 square feet of personal property." She folded her arms. "It was a code violation. We had to act. The board supported it." "Did you pull a permit?" "There wasn't time." "Did you notify the city?" "We have HOA autonomy." "No, you don't. Not for demolition. Not even close." Her face was reddening. "If you had a problem," she said, "you should have followed proper channels." I stepped forward, pulled my wallet, and flipped it open. She stared at the badge inside. "You are—" she stammered. "Yes, Karen, I'm a judge, which means I understand both city code and the full extent of civil liability." She opened her mouth, closed it. I let the silence linger before saying, "We're done here." She shut the door slowly. No apology, no explanation, just the faint click of a woman realizing she stepped into the wrong courtroom. The next morning, I started drafting motions, injunctions, claims for unlawful entry, destruction of property, civil rights interference. I didn't even need to consult a lawyer. This was my domain. She demolished the wrong house, and she picked the wrong man to bulldoze. The morning after I confronted Karen, I received an email from the HOA board. It was titled, Emergency Property Enforcement Action, Justification Statement. I opened it expecting to find formal documentation, maybe an apology, or at least a signed notice from a licensed professional. Instead, it read like a high school essay typed in Comic Sans. According to the letter, my porch extension had violated HOA setback regulations, reduced visual cohesion, and posed a safety risk to neighboring homes. There was no citation of municipal code, no independent inspection, just a bulleted list of observations made by Karen herself, and a vague mention of community concern. Then came the kicker. Given the urgency, the board acted in accordance with executive emergency protocols. In other words, Karen made up an emergency and acted like she was the mayor of a town she didn't even understand. There was no vote, no official record, no motion passed, nothing but her signature and the word approved written in blocky capital letters. I forwarded the email to my court clerk and said, I need a hearing on calendar expedit. By noon, I had filed 3 motions. A temporary restraining order against the HOA to halt any further action on my property, a civil suit for unlawful demolition, trespass, and property destruction, and a personal complaint against Karen for malicious conduct under state tort law. I was halfway through writing the brief when a neighbor texted me a photo. Karen was in her front yard with a garden hose, watering her roses and chatting with a local reporter. I watched the segment that evening, Channel 9. Karen stood in front of a row of hedges, arms folded, smug as ever. We regret the homeowner's reaction, she said, but the HOA acted in good faith to protect the integrity of our community. We simply could not allow unapproved structures to remain. We had no choice. No choice. Those words echoed in my head all night, because choice is exactly what she had. She chose to ignore my permit. She chose to skip the city process. She chose to tear down a private home while its owner was away. And now she was trying to spin it as civic duty. The next morning, the process server handed her the lawsuit on her porch while she was watering her plants. According to my neighbor Stan, she looked confused for a second. Then she read the name on the plaintiff line and turned ghost white. She must have thought the court clerk made a mistake until she saw the signature. But I didn't see her in public for a full week after that. But her lawyer made contact, a man named Fletcher, who opened the conversation with, "Can we resolve this without media escalation?" He said, "Sure, just rebuild my house, admit fault, and resign from the HOA." He didn't laugh, just paused, then said, "I'll take that to my client." He never called back. So we went to court. Karen filed a response filled with technical jargon she didn't understand, citing HOA bylaws like they were constitutional law. Her lawyer tried to argue that I'd intimidated the board with my judicial status, that my porch created neighborhood tension, and that Karen had acted with authority granted by Emergency Code Section 3B. Except Section 3B doesn't allow for demolition. It allows for notification and discussion. That's it. Karen never notified me, never discussed. She sent a contractor with a sledgehammer. And worse, that contractor wasn't even licensed. He had a record, 2 prior citations for unpermitted work, 1 suspended license, no insurance. I found this out on the second day of proceedings. We introduced his name into evidence. The judge raised an eyebrow so high it practically touched his hairline. Karen's face dropped. It was the first time in 2 weeks she looked like she might actually understand what was happening. We were no longer talking about a porch. We were talking about criminal negligence, civil destruction, and personal liability. The kind of case that sets legal precedents and ends HOA board careers. Erin came to court thinking she was going to get a slap on the wrist. She was about to find out what judicial power really looks like. Court rec. Day 1. The gallery was fuller than expected. A few local reporters had picked up the story and neighbors started showing up, curious to see if the rumors were true. Was I really suing the HOA? Did Karen really bulldoze my house without permission? Was I actually a judge? They got answers, all of them. Karen walked in with her lawyer, looking like someone on their way to a job interview they knew they weren't going to get. Her face was drawn tight. Her eyes didn't meet mine. She sat down at the defense table like it might swallow her whole. When the judge called the case, I stood up. Not in a robe, not behind a bench, just a man defending his home. But I could feel the attention in the room shift when I stated my name and my credentials. Your Honor, I said clearly, I am bringing this case not because of who I am, but because of what she did. We started with facts. Permits approved by the city, time-stamped and notarized. Photos of my home before and after the porch extension. The compliance letter I sent to the HOA explaining everything. Ignored. The destruction, documented in full color. Then came Karen's version of the story. Her lawyer argued that the HOA had acted in the best interest of the neighborhood, that the extension was never submitted through the proper channels, and that Karen had followed emergency procedures. The judge asked to see those procedures. Karen's lawyer handed over a printed HOA handbook, dog-eared and coffee-stained. The judge flipped through it. Page 14, Section 3. This allows for board review and notice, he said. It does not allow for demolition. Karen's lawyer replied weakly, it was an extreme situation. Extreme, the judge said, would be a gas leak or a structural collapse. This was a bench and an access ramp. He asked Karen directly, did you notify the city before you initiated demolition? Karen muttered, no. Did you obtain a legal demolition permit? No. Did you speak to the homeowner? She hesitated, then tried. He was uncooperative. The judge leaned forward. Uncooperative is not illegal. And even if it were, that doesn't grant you the right to destroy someone's property. Her lawyer shifted in his seat. Karen looked like she was shrinking. Then we brought out the demolition crew's record. Unlicensed, uninsured, previously fined for code violations in 2 other neighborhoods. Karen claimed she didn't know, that she hired them off a recommendation and paid in cash to expedite the process. The courtroom was silent. My attorney looked at the judge and said, Your Honor, this wasn't enforcement. This was retaliation. We rested our case. The judge announced he would return the following day with a ruling. Karen didn't say a word when she left. She just walked out, stiffly, eyes fixed forward, like the sidewalk might open beneath her feet. That night, I got a text from a neighbor. It was a picture of a handmade sign someone had taped to Karen's door. It read, You demolished the wrong house. I didn't put it there. But I smiled anyway, because they were right. But the next morning, the courtroom was even fuller. Word had spread. Local news vans were parked out front. A few former HOA board members, ones Karen had bulldozed politically, not just literally, sat in the back row. One of them even brought popcorn. Karen sat with her arms crossed, hair pulled tight like she thought a neat bun could hold her whole life together. Her lawyer avoided eye contact with everyone. The judge entered. He didn't waste time. This court finds that the HOA, specifically President Karen, acted beyond the scope of its authority, he began. The demolition was unlawful, unpermitted, and carried out without due process. The court sees clear evidence of malicious intent, negligent hiring, and abuse of positional power. Karen stiffened. The court awards the plaintiff full compensatory damages for the home and its contents, $410,000. Karen's mouth parted slightly. An additional $85,000, 0 cents, for emotional distress and loss of residence. Her jaw clenched. $100,000, 0 cents, in punitive damages for willful misconduct in violation of civil property rights and in disregard of state and municipal law. Her lawyer dropped his pen. The judge continued. Furthermore, the HOA is ordered to issue a formal, public apology to the plaintiff within 30 days and to revise its bylaws to comply with state property law and ADA requirements. Failure to comply will result in additional sanctions. Karen will step down from all HOA rules effective immediately and is barred from holding any board position in the future. Dead silence. You could hear the reporter's camera shutter click 3 times before anyone even blinked. The judge then turned to me. "Sir," he said, "you exercised admirable restraint in the face of unlawful aggression. This court respects not only your rights, but your refusal to misuse your own authority. I hope your new home brings peace, something this neighborhood clearly lacked until now." I thanked him, genuinely. Karen looked like she wanted to protest, to scream, to appeal, to do anything except face the fact that she'd destroyed her own reputation in front of a courtroom full of people who now knew exactly who she was. The lawyer whispered something. She shook her head and whispered back, frantic, but it was done. Outside the courthouse, the reporters were waiting. One asked me, "Do you feel like justice was served?" I said, "Justice wasn't just served. It was rebuilt, one brick at a time." The headline that ran later that night said, "Judge wins lawsuit after rogue HOA demolishes his home. She picked the wrong house to bulldoze." Karen tried to disappear after that. She listed her house the same week. I heard she moved 3 counties over, started fresh. But her name, it followed her. Meanwhile, I started rebuilding. The settlement covered everything, and then some. New foundation, new design, new porch. I even made the new front steps just a little wider, with a side ramp and solar lights built right into the railings. Neighborhood kids helped plant trees. Some of the neighbors who had once looked the other way now stopped to chat. One brought over a pie. Another just said, "We're glad you stayed." I nodded. So am I. The new house took 8 months to finish. Every brick laid, every nail driven, every decision made. It all felt personal. Not just because I was rebuilding what Karen had taken, but because I was reclaiming what she tried to control. I kept the original footprint, but I added height, wider windows, a wraparound porch twice the size of the old one. And just above the door, I had a small brass plaque, custom-made. It read, "Yes, it's legal, signed, the judge." Neighbors started referring to it as the house that Karen built. Though I don't think she'd appreciate the credit, but to me it was perfect. Not out of revenge, just out of principle. I wanted people to see what happens when you stand up for your rights and refuse to be bulldozed, literally or metaphorically. The new HOA board stopped by on move-in day. No clipboards, no paperwork, just warm handshakes and a welcome basket that included coffee, fresh bread, and a note that read, "We're glad you didn't leave." I smiled. Me too. A month later, I hosted a small gathering on the new porch. A few folks who'd kept their distance before now pulled up chairs. They asked about the court case, about Karen, about the moment I found the rubble. I answered, but I kept it short. Because this house, it wasn't about her anymore. It was about setting an example. See, people like Karen exist in every neighborhood. The kind who hide behind rules to justify control. The kind who confuse uniformity with order, compliance with morality. But they always underestimate one thing. Their law doesn't belong to them. It belongs to everyone. And when they use it as a weapon, eventually, they meet someone who knows how to wield it better. In my case, that person just happened to also wear a robe on weekdays. So what happened to Karen? She vanished from the neighborhood completely. Rumor has it she tried to run for HOA board in a new community, but her name came up in a Google search and the campaign didn't last long. You can't exactly win over your neighbors when the top result says, "Demolished judge's home without permission." I didn't need revenge. I had restoration, and more importantly, I had peace. Now, every time I step onto my porch, I don't think about what I lost. I think about what I built. Twice. I think about the laws that protected me, the system that still works when people are willing to fight for it, and the power of knowing when to stay silent and when to speak with authority. So here's the moral, if you're looking for one. If you're going to mess with someone's home, you better make sure you're not stepping onto the wrong property. Because sometimes that quiet guy down the street isn't just another name on the HOA registry. Sometimes he's the one who writes the rules. Thanks for watching. If you've ever dealt with a nightmare HOA or had someone abuse their power against you, tell your story in the comments. I want to hear it. And don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel for more true justice stories, and hit the bell so you never miss when karma strikes back.